Hello everyone, and welcome to Story-Driven English. Today, we're going to explore a story that's as old as America itself. The story of immigration. It's a story of hope, of hardship, of dreams, and of rules. Lots and lots of rules. I want you to meet someone. His name is David. He's a lot like many of us. He's trying to make sense of things. He reads the news, he listens to the debates, and he wonders, what's really going on with immigration in this country? David's not a politician. He's not an expert. He's just a curious citizen, trying to understand how two very different presidents, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, tackled this incredibly complex issue. He saw President Trump, with his focus on building a wall. Animation shows a brick wall being built and tightening border security. Animation shows a Border Patrol agent. He heard the phrase, "America First," a lot. Then he saw President Biden talking about compassion, about welcoming refugees. Animation shows a family being welcomed and about fixing what he called a broken immigration system. Text appears on screen. A more humane approach. David was confused. Two presidents, two completely different approaches. Who was right? What were the real consequences of these policies? And what did it all mean for the people? The real people caught in the middle. So, David started digging. He started reading, researching, and trying to piece together the story. And that's what we're going to do today, together. We're going to follow David's journey of discovery as he explores the contrasting worlds of Trump and Biden's immigration policies. We'll look at the big issues, the wall, asylum, DACA, visas, deportations, all of it. We'll try to understand the why behind the decisions, the impact on people's lives, and the arguments on both sides. We will be using plain, simple English. We're not here to take sides. We're here to learn, to understand, to follow the story wherever it leads us. So join us as we explore the immigration showdown between Trump and Biden. It's a story full of twists and turns of hope and heartbreak, of rules and the human beings affected by them. Let's begin. The Great Wall of comparative analysis, expanded and neutral. This expanded analysis revisits the metaphorical wall to represent the contrasting immigration policies of the Trump and Biden administrations. Instead of a humorous narrative, we'll examine the policies, their stated goals, their implementation, and available data on their effects, all while maintaining strict neutrality. Part 1. The Trump administration. Building the wall literally and figuratively. The Trump administration's approach to immigration was characterized by a strong emphasis on enforcement, both at the border and within the interior of the United States. The central promise, and the most visible symbol, was the construction of a physical wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Border wall construction. The Trump administration secured approximately $15 billion in funding for wall construction through a combination of congressional appropriations and the redirection of funds from other government agencies, notably the Department of Defense, following a declaration of a national emergency. Source: Congressional Research Service, Barrier Funding, and Border Security Issues, 2021. This led to the construction or replacement of approximately 452 miles of border barrier. However, only about 52 miles of that construction were in areas where no barrier previously existed. Source: U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The vast majority replaced existing, often less substantial, fencing. Remain in Mexico Policy Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. This policy, implemented in 2019, required asylum seekers arriving at the southern border to wait in Mexico while their U.S. immigration court cases were processed. Approximately 70,000 asylum seekers were returned to Mexico under MPP. Source: TRAC. Immigration. Syracuse University. Human rights organizations documented significant risks faced by these individuals, including violence, lack of shelter, and limited access to legal representation. Source: Human Rights Watch. We Can't Help You Here, 2021. Increased interior enforcement. The Trump administration broadened the priorities for immigration enforcement within the United States. While previous administrations had primarily focused on individuals with serious criminal records, the Trump administration prioritized the apprehension and removal of any individual in violation of immigration law, regardless of criminal history or length of time in the U.S. Source: Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE Executive Orders and Directives, 2017 to 2021. This led to an increase in arrests of non-criminal immigrants. For instance, ICE non-criminal arrests rose to 37,734 in FY 2018, compared to 23,780 in FY 2016. Source: ICE Annual Report. Travel bans. The Trump administration issued a series of executive orders restricting travel to the United States from several Muslim-majority countries. These travel bans faced numerous legal challenges and were revised multiple times. The final version restricted entry for citizens of Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, North Korea, and Venezuela. Source: Presidential Proclamation 9645, Enhancing Vetting Capabilities and Processes for Detecting Attempted Entry, 2017. Termination of DACA and TPS. The Trump administration attempted to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals (DACA) program, which provides protection from deportation and work authorization to undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. This effort was blocked by the Supreme Court. Source: Department of Homeland Security v. Regents of the University of California, 2020. The administration also moved to terminate temporary protected status (TPS) for nationals of several countries, including El Salvador, Haiti, and Nicaragua. These actions were also subject to legal challenges. Part 2. The Biden Administration. Deconstructing the Wall and Rebuilding a Different Approach. The Biden administration took office with a commitment to reversing many of the Trump administration's immigration policies and pursuing a more humane approach, halting wall construction. On his first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order halting construction of the border wall and rescinding the national emergency declaration used to fund it. However, some limited construction has continued using previously appropriated funds. Ending remain. In Mexico, the Biden administration initially suspended and then formally terminated the MPP program. However, a court order forced the administration to reinstate the policy, leading to a complex legal battle that eventually resulted in the Supreme Court allowing the administration to end. MPP revised enforcement priorities. The Biden administration issued new guidelines for ICE, prioritizing the apprehension and removal of individuals who pose a threat to national security, public safety, or border security. This generally means focusing on individuals with serious criminal convictions, reversing travel bans. President Biden revoked the Trump-era travel bans on his first day in office, strengthening DACA and TPS. The Biden administration has taken steps to fortify the DACA program and has extended or redesignated TPS for nationals of several countries. Addressing root causes. The Biden administration has emphasized a strategy of addressing the root causes of migration from Central America, such as poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity, through increased aid and diplomatic efforts. CBP One app. In an attempt at border control, the CBP One app was introduced. However, it's received criticism for technical failures, language barriers, and the limited number of daily appointments, making it difficult for migrants to use. Part 3. Comparative Analysis and Data Comparing. The two administrations reveal stark differences. Border apprehensions. Border apprehensions initially decreased under Trump, then rose significantly, reaching a peak in 2019 under Biden. Apprehensions initially surged, reaching record highs before declining somewhat. It's important to note that border apprehension numbers are influenced by a multitude of factors, including economic conditions, violence in sending countries, and perceived U.S. policy changes, making it difficult to attribute changes solely to one administration's policies. Asylum claims the Trump administration implemented policies that significantly restricted access to asylum, while the Biden administration has sought to restore access, albeit with ongoing challenges. Interior enforcement. The Trump administration broadened enforcement priorities, leading to increased arrests of non-criminal immigrants, while the Biden administration has narrowed priorities, focusing on those deemed threats. Public opinion. Public opinion about immigration is sharply divided along partisan lines. It is crucial to emphasize that attributing specific outcomes solely to one administration's policies is extremely complex. Migration flows are influenced by a wide range of factors, both within the United States and internationally. Furthermore, The long-term impacts of many of these policies are still unfolding. This analysis provides a factual overview of the policies and available data, avoiding any judgment or preference for either approach. The Great Indoors, a saga of sanctuary cities. Swift removals, and surprisingly similar statistics. Barbie adjusted his Make America Great Again hat, a vintage model, naturally, and settled into his favorite armchair, a well-worn copy of The Art of the Deal on his lap. He was ready to delve back into the fascinating world of interior immigration enforcement. "It's a jungle in there, Mr. Whiskers," he declared to his feline companion. But the Donald, he knew how to navigate it. He remembered the good old days, with a fondness bordering on reverence. The Donald, in Barnaby's view, wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He understood that enforcing immigration law wasn't just about the border. It was about what happened inside the country, too. "Take those sanctuary cities," Barnaby muttered, shaking his head. "Cities that actively hindered ICE. Can you believe it?" Mildred, he turned to his neighbor, who was, as usual, engrossed in her garden. Mildred, bless her heart, was more concerned with Japanese beetles than illegal immigration. Barnaby, however, was very concerned. He'd read on a website that definitely wasn't fake news that the Donald had tried to withhold federal funding from these sanctuary cities. He saw it as a perfectly logical move. "It's like this, Mildred," he'd explained. "If you refuse to help clean up the kitchen, you don't get any dessert." Simple, he recalled. Executive Order 13,768, Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States, issued in January 2017. This order, Barnaby understood, was all about cracking down on sanctuary cities and expanding the categories of immigrants prioritized for removal. It was bold, it was decisive, it was Trumpian. Then there was the issue of expedited removal. Barnaby chuckled. "Brilliant," he exclaimed to Mr. Whiskers. "Why waste time with lengthy court proceedings when you could just expedite things?" He dug up some statistics from a source he trusted implicitly, a website with an eagle logo and lots of American flags. He learned that under the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 235B1, A3, the Secretary of Homeland Security could expand expedited removal to individuals apprehended anywhere in the U.S. who had been in the country for less than 2 years. And the Donald administration did just that. In July 2019, Barnaby also recalled the increased focus on all removable aliens, not just those with serious criminal records. He remembered reading an ICE memo. He'd printed it out. Of course, the February 20th, 2017, memorandum from then-Secretary of Homeland Security, John Kelly, titled Enforcement of the Immigration Laws to Serve the National Interest. This memo, Barnaby understood, made it clear. If you were in the country illegally, you were a priority for removal. Period. He glanced at some more numbers he'd jotted down. ICE non-criminal arrests, 25,598 in FY 2016 under the previous administration, ahem, 37,734 in FY 2018, 34,746 in FY 2019, and 23,887 in FY 2020. A clear upward trend, at least initially. Then came Sleepy Joe. Barnaby sighed. A new sheriff in town, and a very different approach. Sleepy Joe, it seemed, was all about priorities. Only the really, really bad guys. National security threats, public safety threats, recent border questions. It was like focusing only on the weeds that were choking your prize-winning roses, while ignoring all the other weeds popping up everywhere else. He'd read about the February 18, 2021 memorandum from Acting ICE Director Tay Johnson. Interim guidance, civil immigration enforcement, and removal priorities. This memo, Barnaby noted with a frown, significantly narrowed the scope of enforcement. And those sensitive locations, schools, hospitals, places of worship, off-limits to ICE under Sleepy Joe's rules. Barnaby shook his head. It's like giving the squirrels a map to the best nuts in the park. But then the plot thickened. Barnaby, ever vigilant, stumbled upon some very interesting data. Deportations under Biden in fiscal year 2024 were higher than any year under the Donald. The numbers were staggering. Preliminary data showed over 142,000 deportations. Source, news reports citing ICE data, Barnaby was baffled. He reread the numbers. He checked his glasses. He even consulted Mr. Whiskers, who offered no opinion, as usual. He pondered the possibilities. Maybe Sleepy Joe had secretly seen the light. Maybe he'd realized that the Donald's approach, while perhaps a bit robust, was actually quite effective. Or maybe, and this was a thought that Barnaby found particularly intriguing, the sheer number of arrivals, under Sleepy Joe's watch, had simply overwhelmed the system, forcing them to ramp up deportations even with the narrower priorities. He also knew that Title 42, a public health order used during the pandemic to quickly expel migrants, had ended in May 2023. This, Barnaby figured, probably played a role in the increased deportation numbers. Barnaby leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. The world of immigration enforcement was a complicated one, full of twists and turns, and surprisingly similar statistics, even under very different leadership. It just goes to show you, Mr. Whiskers, he concluded, sometimes, even when you change the chef, you end up using the same recipe, or at least getting a similar-sized cake. He smiled, a knowing glint in his eye. The legacy of the Donald, it seemed, lived on. In the numbers at least, and in Barnaby's heart, of course. He reached for another cucumber sandwich. After all, a man had to keep his strength up when defending the interior. The great asylum labyrinth. Navigating the shifting sands of refugee policy under the Donald and Sleepy Joe Barnaby. Our intrepid chronicler of immigration policy adjusted his spectacles, a stack of printed-out articles, government reports, and, of course, his well-loved copy of The Art of the Deal surrounding him like a fortress. He took a long sip of his coffee. Black, no sugar, just like he preferred his immigration policy. Straightforward and strong. Asylum and refugees, Mr. Whiskers, he declared to his ever-patient feline companion, it's like a maze, a constantly shifting politically charged labyrinth. But the Donald, he had a map, a very detailed map. Barnaby recalled the Trump administration's approach with a sense of admiration. It was all about control, about knowing who was coming in and why. And, crucially, about limiting the numbers. He started with metering. Picture this, Mildred. He'd explained to his neighbor, who was, at that moment, battling a particularly stubborn weed. You're hosting a dinner party. You've got a limited number of seats. Do you let everyone in at once, creating chaos? Or do you manage the flow, ensuring everyone gets a fair chance, but in an orderly fashion? The Donald's administration, Barnaby knew, had implemented this. Metering policy at the U.S.-Mexico border, limiting the number of asylum seekers processed at ports of entry each day. He'd seen reports, though precise figures were hard to nail down, suggesting that thousands of asylum seekers were often stuck waiting in Mexican border towns, sometimes for months. Due to this policy, then there were the transit bans. Barnaby chuckled, remembering the Donald's no-nonsense approach. It's simple logic, Mr. Whiskers. If you're fleeing persecution, shouldn't you seek asylum in the first safe country you reach? Not shop around for the best deal. He recalled the July 2019 rule, officially titled Asylum Eligibility and Procedural Modifications, which essentially barred migrants from asylum in the U.S. if they had passed through another country. Without seeking protection there, this, Barnaby believed, was a masterstroke of strategic thinking. And the Asylum Cooperative Agreements, ACAs, Barnaby considered these the Donalds to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, designed to send asylum seekers to those countries to have their claims processed. He'd read that while the implementation was limited. The threat of being sent to one of these countries served as a powerful deterrent. For example, under the ACA with Guatemala, nearly 1,000 Hondurans and Salvadorans were sent there before the agreement was terminated by the Biden administration. Barnaby turned to his meticulously organized folder on refugee admissions. The numbers told a clear story. The Donald had dramatically reduced the refugee ceiling, the maximum number of refugees allowed to enter the U.S. each year. He pointed to a chart, his finger tracing the downward trend. Look, Mr. Whiskers, from 85,000 in fiscal year 2016 under the previous administration, mind you, to 45,000 in FY 2018, 30,000 in FY 2019, and then a historic low of 18,000 in FY 2020. And then, of course, there was Title 42. Barnaby remembered the early days of the pandemic. fear, uncertainty, and the Donald taking decisive action, invoking this public health authority under the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. CDC allowed for the rapid expulsion of migrants at the border, bypassing the usual asylum process. Between March 2020 and the end of the Trump presidency, there were over 400,000 expulsions under Title 42. Enter Sleepy Joe. Barnaby sighed, a mixture of exasperation and grudging respect in his voice. The new administration, he knew, had promised a very different approach. Sleepy Joe had vowed to end the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP, which Barnaby considered another of the Donald's efficient policies. He'd read about the legal battles, the back and forth, the eventual, and, in Barnaby's view, unfortunate termination of MPP. He'd seen the headlines about Biden raising the refugee ceiling, 62,504 FY 2021, though they only admitted a fraction of that, and then 125,000 for FY 2022 and FY 2023, and again 125,000 proposed for FY 2024, but admissions, Barnaby noted with a smirk, were trailing far behind that target. But, and Barnaby always looked for the but, Sleepy Joe wasn't completely abandoning all forms of control. There was this circumvention of lawful pathways rule, introduced in May 2023, source, Federal Register, Volume 88, No. 91. Barnaby explained it. To Mr. Whiskers, it's like this. You want to come to the party? Fine, but you have to use the front door, the CBP One app in this case, or have a very good reason for sneaking in through the back, specific exceptions, like facing imminent danger. If you didn't, you were presumed ineligible for asylum. Sound familiar? It did to Barnaby. It sounded a lot like the Donald's transit ban, just repackaged, and then there was the D of Barnabas analysis. Title 42, Sleepy Joe, despite criticizing it during his campaign, had continued to use it, and not just a little, a lot. In fact, under the Biden administration, millions of expulsions occurred under Title 42, far exceeding the number under Trump. Barnaby leaned back, a triumphant gleam in his eye. The numbers don't lie, Mr. Whiskers. Both administrations, despite their very different rhetoric, found themselves grappling with the same fundamental challenge: how to manage the flow of people seeking refuge. The Donald, he built walls, both literal and figurative. Sleepy Joe, he talked about bridges, but he also kept a few gates in place. And sometimes, he added with a wink, he even used the Donald's old gatekeeper, Title 42. He closed his folder, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. The world of asylum and refugee policy was indeed a labyrinth, but Barnaby, armed with his data, his wit, and his unwavering faith in the Donald's approach, felt he had navigated it with aplomb. The lesson, Mr. Whiskers, he concluded, is that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to learn from the masters, even if you don't admit it publicly. He reached for another cup of coffee, ready for whatever new immigration policy twists and turns might come his way. He was, after all, Barnaby, the self-appointed guardian of the sensible approach to immigration, the great visa vortex. A deep dive into the shifting sands of American immigration policy. With charts, Barnaby, our self-proclaimed immigration expert, adjusted his iLegal immigration t-shirt, a gift from his nephew, a lawyer who definitely understood the importance of following the rules, and surveyed his meticulously organized research materials. He had charts, graphs, printouts of government regulations, and even a color-coded map of the world, highlighting countries subject to various travel restrictions. Visas, Mr. Whiskers, he declared, are not just pieces of paper. They're the keys to the kingdom. And the Donald, he understood the importance of being a very discerning gatekeeper. He fondly recalled the Trump administration's unwavering commitment to extreme vetting. This wasn't just a slogan, Barnaby believed. It was a philosophy. It meant scrutinizing every visa application with the utmost care, looking for any red flags, any potential threats to national security. He remembered the infamous travel bans, which, in Barnabas's view, were simply a common-sense measure to protect the country from individuals coming from countries with questionable vetting procedures. He'd followed the legal battles closely. From the initial executive order, 13,769, January 27, 2017, which targeted 7 Muslim-majority countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Proclamation 9645. September 24, 2017, which included a slightly different list of countries: Chad, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen. Barnaby had even researched the legal justifications for the travel bans, citing the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, Section 212F, which grants the President broad authority to suspend the entry of aliens deemed detrimental to the interests of the United States. He saw it as a clear example of a president using his constitutional powers to protect the nation. But it wasn't just about travel bans. Barnaby knew that the Trump administration had also tightened the screws on various visa programs, particularly the H-1B visa for highly skilled workers. He'd read numerous reports about the Buy American and Hire American Executive Order, EO 13788, April 18, 2017, and its impact on the H-1B migrant. He pulled out a chart showing the increase in requests for evidence, RFEs, and denial rates. For H-1B petitions during the Trump years, "Look, Mr. Whiskers," he exclaimed, the denial rate for new H-1B petitions went from 6% in FY 2015 to 21% in FY 2018, and the denial rate for continuing H-1B petitions for workers already in the U.S. went from 3% to 12%. Source: National Foundation for American Policy Analysis of U.S. CIS data. To Barnaby, this wasn't a sign of unfairness. It was a sign of rigor. It meant that companies couldn't just bring in foreign workers without proving they were truly needed and that qualified American workers weren't available. He also remembered the rumblings about birthright citizenship. The Donald Barnaby recalled had questioned whether the 14th Amendment automatically granted citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., regardless of their parents' immigration status. While no formal action was taken, the very discussion, Barnaby believed, signaled a willingness to challenge long-standing interpretations of the Constitution. And then there was the issue of gender recognition, a topic Barnaby found somewhat bewildering. But he understood that the Trump administration's policies had created potential hurdles for transgender and non-binary individuals seeking visas or other immigration benefits. Then Sleepy Joe arrived, promising a new era of openness and fairness. Barnaby sighed, a mixture of skepticism and resignation in his voice. The first order of business: rescinding the travel bans. Proclamation 10,141, January 20, 2021. It's like taking down the "Beware of Dog" sign and hoping for the best, Barnaby muttered. And then came the changes to the visa programs. Sleepy Joe, Barnaby observed, seemed determined to make it easier for foreign students and professionals, particularly in STEM fields. To come to the USHED, read about the updates to the J-1 Exchange Visitor Skills List, adding fields like data science and cloud computing to the list of skills eligible for exchange programs. He'd seen the announcements about modernizing the H-1B program, potentially streamlining the application process and increasing the number of visas available. And he'd learned about the extensions to the cap-gap period for F-1 students, allowing them to stay in the U.S. longer while waiting for their H-1B visas to be processed. Barnaby also reviewed the Biden administration's plan to offer a path to permanent residency for certain H-1B visa holders and their dependents. Barnaby was torn. He understood the arguments about attracting global talent and boosting American competitiveness. He'd even read articles about the economic benefits of immigration, citing studies that showed how immigrants contribute to innovation, entrepreneurship, and job creation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Sleepy Joe was being a bit too welcoming. "It's like inviting everyone to the Thanksgiving feast, Mr. Whiskers," he said, "but not checking to see if we have enough chairs, enough food, enough room." He'd leaned back, surveying his charts and graphs. The data told a complex story. The Trump administration had clearly prioritized security and the protection of American workers, leading to tighter restrictions on visa issuance. The Biden administration, while still mindful of security, had shifted the focus to economic competitiveness and attracting global talent, leading to a more welcoming approach. The long-term consequences, Mr. Whiskers Barnaby concluded, are yet to be seen. Will Sleepy Joe's policies lead to a brain drain from other countries, boosting American innovation? Or will they lead to increased competition for American workers, driving down wages and opportunities? Only time will tell. He took a final sip of his coffee, a determined glint in his eye. He would continue to monitor the situation to analyze the data to defend the principles of orderly immigration. He was, after all, Barnaby, the self-appointed guardian of the sensible visa policy, and he had a feeling this story was far from over. The Great Immigration Balancing Act, DACA, TPS, and the art of the presidential Titra Barnaby, our self-appointed immigration policy guru, adjusted his "I know my rights and responsibilities" button and took a sip of his coffee decaf. Time, as the evening wore on. He was ready to tackle the complex and often emotional topic of specific immigrant groups, and how the Donald and Sleepy Joe had approached their unique situations. "It's like walking a tightrope, Mr. Whiskers," he confided to his ever-attentive cat. "You've got to balance compassion with rules." And the Donald, he was a master balancer, or at least he tried to be. He started with DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Barnaby remembered the program's origins under the Obama administration, a policy he viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. It was designed to protect young people brought to the U.S. illegally as children. The so-called Dreamers, the Donald Barnaby recalled, had a complicated relationship with DACA. He'd expressed sympathy for the Dreamers, but he also believed the program was an overreach of executive authority. He remembered the September 2017 announcement by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions declaring that DACA was being rescinded. Source: Department of Justice press release, September 5, 2017. He'd also seen Executive Order 13,767, Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements. This set off a firestorm of legal challenges and protests. Barnaby, while sympathetic to the plight of the Dreamers, believed that the Donald was right to question the legality of the program. He saw it as a matter of principle. The president shouldn't be able to create laws out of thin air. The Supreme Court eventually weighed in, ruling in Department of Homeland Security v. Regents of the University of California 2020 that the Trump administration's attempt to end DACA was unlawful because they hadn't followed the proper procedures. Barnaby grumbled about activist judges, but he acknowledged the ruling. Then came Sleepy Joe. Barnaby sighed. The new administration, predictably, took a very different approach. Sleepy Joe, on his very first day in office, issued a memorandum directing the Department of Homeland Security to preserve and fortify DACA. Source: Memorandum on Preserving and Fortifying Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, January 20, 2021. And in August 2022, the Biden administration issued a final rule to formally codify the DACA program into regulation. Source: Federal Register, Volume 87, No. 167. But. And Barnaby always looked for the but. The legal battles weren't over. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, Barnaby knew, had ruled against DACA's legality, even with the new rule. Source: Texas v. United States, Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The whole thing was a legal mess, a testament to the ongoing debate about executive power and immigration policy. He'd also read about the Biden administration making it easier for DACA recipients to get employer-sponsored visas. Barnaby then turned his attention to TPS, Temporary Protected Status. This program, he knew, provides temporary protection from deportation and work authorization to individuals from countries facing armed conflict, natural disasters, or other extraordinary conditions. The Donald, Barnaby recalled, had taken a skeptical view of TPS. He believed that many of these designations had been extended for too long, becoming a kind of de facto permanent residency. He remembered the Trump administration's attempts to terminate TPS for several countries, including Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Sudan, Honduras, and Nepal. This, Barnaby believed, was a necessary step to restore the temporary nature of the program. And then there was Venezuela. The Trump administration initially resisted calls to grant TPS to Venezuelans fleeing the Maduro regime, though they eventually did grant a similar form of protection, called Deferred Enforced Departure DED. On Trump's last full day on office, Sleepy Joe, of course, reversed course. He granted TPs to Venezuelans in March 2021 and later extended and redesignated it. He also extended or redesignated TPS for several other countries, including Haiti, Somalia, and Yemen. Barnaby was conflicted. He understood the humanitarian impulse behind TPS, but he also worried about the program becoming a permanent solution to temporary problems. He also knew that Trump ordered a review of Biden's TPS designations. It's like offering someone a guest room for the night. Mr. Whiskers, he mused, and then they end up staying for years. It's kind, but is it sustainable? He leaned back, contemplating the complexities of DACA and TPS, both programs, he realized, were caught in a political and legal tug-of-war. The Donald had tried to rein them in, prioritizing strict enforcement of immigration laws and questioning the limits of executive power. Sleepy Joe had tried to expand them, prioritizing humanitarian concerns and providing protection to vulnerable populations. The fundamental question, Mr. Whiskers, Barnaby concluded, is this: who gets to decide who stays in America, and under what terms? The president, Congress, the courts? It's a question that has been debated for decades, and I suspect, he added with a twinkle in his eye, it will continue to be debated for many years to come, especially if I have anything to say about it. He reached for his coffee, ready to continue his vigil, ever watchful of the shifting sands of American immigration policy. He was, after all, Barnaby, the self-appointed guardian of the principled approach to immigration. And he had a feeling the next chapter in this saga would be just as interesting as the last. The great welfare wrangle, public charge, personal responsibility, and the perils of the public. Barnaby, our resident immigration policy aficionado, smoothed his eye, paid my taxes, and you should too, t-shirt, and settled into his armchair. A steaming mug of coffee and a stack of documents at the ready. Public charge, Mr. Whiskers, he announced to his feline audience, is a fancy way of saying, can you stand on your own 2 feet? And the Donald, he believed in strong feet. He remembered the Trump administration's efforts to tighten the rules on who could be considered a public charge, someone likely to become primarily dependent on the government for support. This, Barnaby believed, was just common sense. It's like this, Mildred, he'd explained to his neighbor, who was, at that moment, meticulously counting the blooms on her prize-winning rosebush. You wouldn't invite someone to live in your house if they weren't going to contribute. Would you want them to help with the chores, pay their share of the bills, be a responsible house guest? The Trump administration, Barnaby knew, had issued a final rule in August 2019, significantly expanding the definition of public charge. This rule made it harder for immigrants to get green cards if they had used or were deemed likely to use certain public benefits, such as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, Section 8 housing assistance, with some exceptions, and other programs. Barnaby had even made a list. He believed that factors like income, health, age, skills, and family size should be considered when determining if someone was likely to become a public charge. He thought this made perfect sense. He'd even researched the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, Section 212A4. He'd read reports about how the Trump administration's public charge rule had led to a chilling effect, with some immigrant families disenrolling from public benefit programs even when they were eligible, out of fear that it would hurt their immigration status. Barnaby, while acknowledging the potential for hardship, saw this as a sign that the rule was working. It was encouraging self-sufficiency and discouraging reliance on government assistance. Then Sleepy Joe took office. Barnaby sighed, the familiar refrain echoing in his mind. A new administration, a new approach. Sleepy Joe, predictably, wasted no time in reversing the Trump-era public charge rule. He issued Executive Order 14,012, restoring faith in our legal immigration systems and strengthening integration and inclusion efforts for new Americans. In the 1st of February 2021, this order that directed federal agencies to review the Trump administration's public charge rule.n in December 2022. The Biden administration issued its own final rule, largely reverting to the guidance that had been in place since 1999. This rule, Barnaby knew, focused primarily on receipt of cash assistance for income maintenance, like supplemental security, income, SSI, or temporary assistance for needy families, TANF. Long-term institutionalization at government expense, Barnaby grumbled. It's like saying, "Come on in, everyone. The buffet is open." But who's paying for the buffet, Mr. Whiskers? Who's paying? He'd also read that Biden made it very clear that things like SNAP, CHIP, Medicaid, except for long-term institutionalization, would not be held against an immigrant. He understood the arguments about fairness and compassion. He knew that many immigrants work hard and contribute to society, and that sometimes they need a little help, especially when they're first starting out. He also knew that some were scared to apply even for benefits their children. U.S. citizens were entitled to, with numbers showing a drop in enrollment in Medicaid and CHIP. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Sleepy Joe was being a bit too lenient. He worried about the potential strain on public resources, about the message it sent to prospective immigrants. The bottom line, Mr. Whiskers Barnaby concluded, is that we need to be welcoming, but we also need to be responsible. The Donald, he understood that. He wanted to make sure that everyone who came to America was ready to pull their own weight. Sleepy Joe, he seems to be more focused on making sure everyone has a comfortable seat at the table, even if they can't afford to bring a dish to pass. He took a final sip of his coffee, a determined look on his face. He would continue to monitor the situation, to analyze the data, to champion the cause of fiscal responsibility in immigration policy. He was, after all, Barnaby, the self-appointed guardian of the sustainable approach to immigration. And he had a feeling this debate was far from over. The border wall, holding the line against chaos, a different perspective. Meet Hank. Hank is a retired construction worker, a proud American, and a firm believer in the rule of law. He lives in a small town near the U.S.-Mexico border, and he's seen firsthand the challenges of uncontrolled immigration. He's not against immigration, mind you, but he believes it needs to be legal and orderly, and he strongly supported President Trump's efforts to secure the border. It's simple, Hank would say, sipping his coffee at the local diner. You can't have a country without borders, and you can't have borders without rules, and you can't have rules without enforcement. He remembered the spring of 2018 when the Trump administration announced its zero-tolerance policy. He'd seen the news reports, the images of children being separated from their parents at the border. It was tough to watch, no doubt about it. But Hank saw it differently than the mainstream media. He saw it as a necessary consequence of illegal actions. If you break into my house, he'd argue, you go to jail. And if you bring your kids with you, well, they can't go to jail with you, can they? It's a terrible situation, but it's the parents' fault, not the government's. He believed that the zero-tolerance policy was a deterrent. A tough deterrent, yes, but a necessary one. He'd seen the reports of caravans of migrants heading towards the border, the overwhelming numbers of people trying to cross illegally. He believed that something drastic had to be done. He points to the Attorney General Jeff Sessions' memo of April 6, 2018. Zero tolerance for offenses under Section 1325A that, to him, showed decisive action. The liberals, Hank would say, shaking his head, they talk about compassion, about human rights. But what about the rights of American citizens? What about the rule of law? What about the safety and security of our communities? He knew that the policy had been challenged in court, that a federal judge had ordered the government to reunite families. He'd read about the ACLU lawsuit, Ms. L.V. Ice, but he believed that the judge was overstepping his bounds, interfering with the president's authority to enforce immigration law. He'd also heard the criticisms, the accusations of cruelty and inhumanity, but he dismissed them as fake news, the product of a liberal media bias against Trump. He believed that the media was exaggerating the problem, focusing on the emotional stories while ignoring the larger issue of border security. Then came the Biden administration. Hank watched with dismay as the new president reversed Trump's policies, established a task force to reunite families, and condemned the zero-tolerance approach as a moral failing. Executive Order 14,011, it's all well and good to talk about compassion, Hank would say. But what about the message it sends? It's like saying, come on in, folks, we'll figure it out later. He worried that the Biden administration's policies would encourage more illegal immigration, leading to even greater chaos at the border. He'd seen reports of increased border crossings, of overwhelmed Border Patrol agents, of communities struggling to cope with the influx of migrants, and he was particularly troubled by the reports that family separations were still happening, even under Biden. Not as a matter of official policy, of course, but as a result of bureaucratic hurdles, differing interpretations of the rules, and sometimes legitimate concerns about the safety of the children. "It's ironic, isn't it?" Hank would say. "They criticize Trump for separating families, but they're still doing it, just in a quieter way." He'd point to reports from the various inspector generals. Hank knew that the issue of family separation was a complex one. He didn't want to see children separated from their parents, but he believed that the primary responsibility lay with the parents who chose to cross the border illegally. "It's a tough situation," he'd admit, "but you can't have open borders. You can't have chaos. You have to have rules, and you have to enforce them." And sometimes he'd add, his voice hardening, "Enforcement means making tough choices." He firmly believed that President Trump had made the tough choices, the necessary choices, to protect the border and uphold the rule of law. And he worried that the Biden administration, in its eagerness to be compassionate, was undermining the progress that had been made. "We need to build that wall," Hank would say, his voice filled with conviction. "We need to secure the border. We need to send a clear message. If you want to come to America, you have to do it the right way, the legal way." He was, after all, Hank, a proud American, a believer in the rule of law, and a staunch defender of the secured border. And he knew that this debate was far from over. The future of American immigration policy, he believed, hung in the balance. A comparative analysis of the Trump and Biden administration's immigration policies reveals fundamentally different approaches to managing a complex and critical aspect of national governance. The Trump administration, facing significant challenges at the border and inheriting an outdated immigration system, prioritized national security, border control, and the strict enforcement of existing laws. This approach, while often characterized as harsh by critics, sought to establish clear boundaries, deter illegal immigration, and ensure that those seeking entry to the United States did so through established legal channels. It's the construction of physical barriers, the implementation of policies like MPP, and the reduction in refugee admissions reflected a commitment to a controlled and orderly immigration system. The Biden administration, in contrast, initially adopted a significantly more lenient approach, emphasizing humanitarian concerns and seeking to address the root causes of migration. While these are laudable goals, the rapid reversal of many Trump-era policies, coupled with a perceived relaxation of enforcement, contributed to a surge in border crossings and created new challenges for border security and immigration management. Although the Biden administration later implemented some stricter enforcement measures, the initial shift created a perception of open borders, potentially incentivizing further irregular migration. Several key themes emerge from this comparison. The Trump administration understood that national security is paramount, and that a nation's ability to control its borders is fundamental to its sovereignty. While economic considerations and humanitarian values are important, they cannot supersede the need for a secure and orderly immigration system. The Biden administration's initial emphasis on humanitarian concerns, while well-intentioned, arguably neglected the crucial role of deterrence in managing migration flows. The subsequent need to re-implement stricter measures underscores the inherent challenges of balancing compassion with the practical realities of border control. The legal challenges faced by both administrations highlight the contentious nature of immigration policy, but it's crucial to recognize the difference in their origins. Challenges to the Trump administration's policies often stemmed from disagreements with the substance of the policies, a belief that they were too restrictive. Challenges to the Biden administration's policies, on the other hand, often arose from concerns about implementation and the perceived circumvention of established legal processes. The contrasting nature is very important. The overall impact of these policies reflects these differing priorities. The Trump administration's policies, while controversial, aimed to create a more predictable and manageable immigration system, prioritizing the interests of American citizens and legal residents. The Biden administration's policies, while intended to be more humane, have arguably created greater uncertainty and instability at the border, while not fully solving the issues at hand. The persistently high deportation numbers under Biden, despite a stated shift in priorities, demonstrate the ongoing challenges of managing large-scale migration. Ultimately, the Trump administration's approach to immigration, while demanding and often criticized, recognize the fundamental importance of border security, the rule of law, and a controlled immigration system. The challenges faced by the Biden administration in managing the consequences of a more lenient approach underscore the enduring validity of the core principles that guided the Trump administration's policies. A nation must control its borders, enforce its laws, and prioritize the safety and well-being of its citizens. The need for comprehensive immigration reform remains, but such reform must be grounded in these fundamental principles to be truly effective and sustainable. That cannot control its borders cannot effectively control its destiny. And so, David's journey through the maze of American immigration policy comes to, well, not an end, exactly. Because, as we've seen, this is a story that's constantly evolving, constantly being rewritten. He's learned that there are no easy answers, no simple solutions. He's seen the stark contrast between the Trump administration's focus on strict enforcement, border security, and a more restrictive approach to immigration overall, and the Biden administration's initial attempts to create a more welcoming humanitarian system while still grappling with the realities of border control and political pressure. He's seen how decisions made in Washington have profound, real-world consequences for individuals and families, for asylum seekers, for DACA recipients, for skilled workers, for communities across the country. He's learned that the immigration debate isn't just about politics, it's about people. Journey has also shown him the enduring power of the American dream, the belief that this is a land of opportunity, a place where people from all over the world can come to build a better life. But he's also seen the challenges, the complexities, the ongoing struggle to balance that dream with the need for order, security, and a system that works for everyone. And perhaps the most important lesson David learned is that our story, is far from over. The debate about immigration will continue. New policies will be proposed, challenged, and implemented. The future of American immigration remains unwritten. So, what are your takeaways from David's journey and from this comparison of Trump and Biden's immigration policies? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, your own stories, and if you found this video helpful, informative, or even just a little bit thought-provoking, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps our channel grow. Share this video with your friends, your family, anyone who's interested in understanding the complexities of immigration policy. Let's get the conversation going. And finally, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Story Driven English for more videos exploring complex topics in a clear, engaging, and story-driven way. We've got lots more to explore together. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you in the next video.